Welcome to another Rooster Talk, the first one here for 2022. We're back at the UWA club here in Crawley. Today I've got Allan Kelly here from Miramar Resources, who's going to give us an update on what's been happening. As we know, we can see on the announcers, a lot of activity's been happening since we last spoke. Welcome, Allan.
Yeah, thanks.
Look, Allan, you guys have been doing a fair bit since our last coffee with Samso.
Yeah.
Far away, let us know what's been happening.
Yeah, well, we've been busy, probably mostly at Gidji, which is, developing into our flagship project. Before Christmas, we did a 10,000 metre air core program there. That's the biggest program we've done since listing. And that was focused on our marlebone target, where we did some infill air core lines, and then we also extended it to the north on some tenements that we got granted sort of about midway through last year, so they hadn't been drilled at all. And unfortunately, given the current lab turnaround times, we're not going to see those assay results for a little while. But that will, that really will show us the true size of that marlebone footprint. But what we decided to do, given the fact that there's so many delays in assay results at the moment, we've got an RC rig, and we're drilling some holes right across the main part of the marlebone anomaly as we speak. So that program is about 2,500 metres, depending on what we see, and that's going to go right across the guts of marlebone for the first time, and it'll test beneath the best air core results that we've got to date. And just to remind people that the marlebone footprint as it stands, it's about 2 kilometres long in strike and about 1 K wide, and it's based on air core holes just going down to refusal. So we've got about 40 odd metres of transported material and paleo channel sands and clays and everything, which hampered previous exploration. But we're drilling through that, and then we're getting sort of a few metres of weathered basement before we hit refusal. So that sort of plume of gold that we're seeing, above 2 grams per tonne up to sort of 6, almost 7 grams per tonne, that's like 2 Ks by 1 K. So that's a very similar size to what you see at Paddington, or what you see at something like Aphrodite, or any of these other deposits that are hosted along that Barara or Bardock shear zone. So that's pretty exciting. Obviously then we wait for those assay results, but then after that we're going to roll into an air core program where we're going to test a couple of new targets that sit in an on echelon position, so basically like a parallel position. So if you've got marlebone here, we've got a thing called Blackfriars, which is about 1 K long with 1 gram hits in air core. And then over the holidays we're sort of looking at some historical data and came up with another target called Highway, which sits underneath the highway, and it's a big 1 kilometre long auger anomaly from mid-90s that's never been drilled, and it sits in this sort of parallel position to marlebone and Blackfriars. So when you start looking at all these opportunities that are presenting themselves, I'm pretty convinced that this is a camp. It's a gold camp, which means that there's multiple deposits of different sizes and in different geologies. If you look at where it sits, we're about 15 Ks from Kalgoorlie, 15 Ks north of Kalgoorlie and about 15 Ks up to Paddington. And, there's a pretty strong belief that gold deposits are sort of periodical. So, along a major structure, they occur at sort of a set sort of spacing, and about 30 Ks is the spacing that most people sort of believe is where these deposits sit. So we're at this sort of 15 K spacing, which means we're like potentially, in the intermediary position. So I'm convinced it's a camp. It's going to be a camp. The question will be, how big is the biggest deposit, and how many ounces are there in total there? Because every time we drill one of these targets, we get more gold. So it's just a matter of systematically working through it and working at how big it is.
What's intriguing to me, obviously now that you've done so much work, and I remember the first time we had a conversation, I was a bit surprised at where it was and how big it was in terms of where your position.
Land position, yeah.
And the consistency of your results look, it's one of those boring projects that's going to be building over time, and it's just suddenly
Yep.
going to be a monster.
Yep.
And I think that's where monsters of this kind of projects tend to be, right?
Yep.
We they're not sexy, but then they work.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm getting the feeling that we're seeing in Gidji, is that
Yep.
you seem to be getting that, and then the consistency of
Yep.
of the size of your essays
Yeah. So we've got about a 15-kilometre long strike length of the Barara shear zone, which is a major regional mineralised structure. At one end you got Barara and Golden Ridge, and then you got us, and then you got Paddington, and then it joins up and becomes the Bardock shear zone. So then you got Bardock, and you got Aphrodite, and you got Zoroastrian, and you got all these things that keep going up. We've got about 15 k's of strike of this, and really to date we've focused on about the central 5 k's, because that was what was available when we listed. That was the bit that was granted. But since then we've got the northern bit granted, and we've got the southern bit granted. So there's another 4 or 5 kilometre strike length of this shear zone to the north that's mostly covered by sort of lake and stuff that we can't wait to get the rig out there, because that's the same geology again as Marylebone and Paddington, same structures, and not a significant drill hole in it. So this is, I sort of kicked myself a bit that we could actually pick up a land position like this, and you could argue that you could float a company just on this by itself.
Oh,
and
no,
there's plenty of companies
yeah.
in the goldfields that haven't got a land position like that, and attracting high valuation. So I can see what I think it is, and I'm trying to get that across to investors that this is a great land position, great geology, we're getting results, and I think there will be a camp here. It's a matter of how big and how many deposits. So that's our challenge, to do it systematically, and it's making it hard when the assay turnarounds are taking so long. So,
but I think when we look at the historical data, I mean, we start off having a discussion about Runway, and the amount of intercepts that's there, that's got to be, I mean, that's sort of like, if it's that you have that there now, surely there's more along that whole shear, right?
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons that I think we're looking at a camp as well. So I've been in gold exploration for most of my 30 years as a geologist, and I worked in gold exploration teams in Western mining with some really smart people, and we weren't just looking at stuff in the eastern goldfields or the Murchison. We were looking at stuff in the Abitibi in Canada. We were looking at stuff in West Africa, and comparing and contrasting these Archean greenstone gold deposits. So I picked up a lot of knowledge from really smart people in Western mining over the time I was there. And one of the key signatures of a camp is that you get multiple deposits, different styles in different host rocks, right? So I guess the idea is that there's so much gold in the system that it can't just go to one rock type like a biff or a dolerite. It ends up in a bit over here in a felsic volcanic, a bit in a biff, a bit in a mafic. It's just, there's so much in the system. Now obviously we're 15 k's from Kalgoorlie,
I know,
richest bloody patch of ground in the world, right? So there's a lot of gold in the system here. But if you look at what we've got at Gidji, we've got gold in mafic and ultramafic rocks at Marylebone. We've got gold in felsic volcanics at Blackfriars. Highway is probably going to be the same. And then at Runway, you've got these sort of mafic and felsic porphyries, which Northern Star have got a resource on at Runway, 300,000 ounces, and that same unit continues onto our ground. We've got gold in black shale at Piccadilly. So you've got gold in all these different rock types, and they're all different. To me, that's a sign that you've got a camp. It's just a matter of working out how big it is, and we are doing the first systematic, effective exploration of the project, because all the previous drilling was angled, RAB, and didn't even get through the transported material. And we're showing that by drilling next historical holes and getting 13 grams where they got nothing. So I'm really excited about the project. It's revealing itself sort of with each drill program, you know. And you know, I'm convinced there's going to be a camp there. It's just a matter how big it is.
I mean, you got neighbours around you, and you spoke about KCGM working at Runway.
Yep.
Are they active out there? I mean, you're active, but
they're very active at Runway. There hasn't been much done there for a number of years, but in the last probably 6 months, they've kicked off at Runway, and you know, they've got a diamond rig that's sitting about 20 metres off our tenement boundary, and they've been there for months. You know, so they're drilling, they're active. To put it in context, you know, about 20 metres off our tenement boundary, there's a number of holes, diamond holes, that were drilled to drill out this Runway resource back in 2015, 16, I think it was, and then nothing really happened with it. There was one hole that was drilled like a couple of years later, and that was drilled down dip, and it got 280 metres at 1 gram, and that they drilled down this porphyry unit, and that's like 20 metres off our boundary. And so their rig at the moment is sitting right next to that hole, and they've been drilling, as I say, they've been drilling for months. So
for them to be there for months, there must be.
Well, there must be something there, right? But the thing is, it's Northern Star, so unless it's huge, they're not going to announce it. But just the simple fact that they're there and they're drilling tells us that there's something there. Now, we know there's something there because historical blocks to look at, right? Yeah, and there's good hits there.
Yeah. And it's coming into your boundaries.
Yeah, so the matter for us was, the issue for us was how deep it was and whether it would be economic for us. Now, we drilled, so when was it? Probably it was May, June last year. We drilled a couple of diamond holes on our side of the boundary, but they were about 100 metres, 150 metres away from the tenement boundary, because we thought there was a southerly plunge which would have made it a bit shallower on our side. Now, we hit all the right geology, and we got some visible gold and quartz veins and stuff, but when we actually hit the porphyry, there wasn't much in it. But we're sort of hearing that the drilling they're doing is a fair bit deeper. So the question for us is whether we sort of take the plunge and step out and go a bit deeper and try and replicate what they're seeing. But again, the question is whether it would be economic for us at that depth. If you hit even a very wide 1 gram hit, if it's at 400 metres below surface, you question whether it's economic or not, compared to Marylebone, where if you drilled out a 2, 3, 4 gram deposit like a Paddington below 40 metres of cover, well, that's economic. That's easily economic. So you know, we haven't written off 8 Mile, which is what we call our side of things. They got Runway, we got 8 Mile. We haven't written it off, so we're going to keep an eye on what happens there. But at some point, we'll probably go back and maybe have another look at the holes there. There's some talk about applying for an EIS hole, you know, a deep diamond hole, part funding by the government. So that would make sense. Interestingly, one of the things that we did when we did the diamond drilling last year, we did an orientation IP line, induced potential polarisation. So, and that was basically along the tenement boundary. And that shows something at about 400 metres. So there is indications of something there, but just, you know, a 650 metre hole cost you about the same as 100 air core holes, right? And 100 air core holes could give you a whole new target, whereas 1 diamond hole is is risky. So they're the sort of thoughts you have when you're a junior explorer. Now, if we can get the government to pay for 50% of that, fantastic. So we had that discussion. We've had that discussion quite a bit recently about, you know, whether we do that. I think we'll apply. And then to see what happens. If we don't get money, whether we do it anyway, you know. So. And in the meantime, we'll see what they come up with as well. So,
Look, you know, I mean, Gidji is as you say, it's got a life of its own, and I think it's strategically placed for discovery down the road. I mean,
corporate activity too, right?
If
we find something, we expect to get a knock on the door, right?
I think that would be a very, very possible thing. I'm sure they, if they find something down in Runway, I think you might get a knock on the door anyway.
Yeah.
Look, the other thing that I've noticed recently that you've done some work in your Bangemall stuff, which we just touched on in our previous discussion. Can you share with us that one?
So to give you some background behind the Bangemall stuff, so as well as a lot of gold experience, I've also got a fair bit of nickel experience too. So I did my honours thesis in nickel at Forestania when it was owned by Outokumpu. That's part of the reason I got my first job with Western Mining, was that I had nickel experience as a geochemist. Then I did a little bit of work in nickel in North America, but I also worked in exploration around Leinster for Western Mining for nickel. And then my last job at Western Mining before I left was a combined nickel exploration team that was basically looking at the whole Yilgarn. So the way it worked back then is we had the exploration division and we had the gold business unit, the nickel business unit. So they had their mines, but they also had sort of their exploration teams. And then the exploration division were doing the other stuff like West Musgraves, the sort of more remote stuff. So, we picked up the Gun Barrel and Kohlrabi projects on the basis of work that I did, and then we made discoveries there and stuff. So, but I got really interested in this Craton margin sort of stuff, like the Voisey Bay, Raglan.
West Musgrave.
Yeah, but this is, so it's just after West Musgraves. So but Voisey Bay, Raglan, West Musgraves, Norilsk, these Craton margin things where you got Proterozoic edges of these Archean Cratons. And when I was working for Avoca, GSWA released these regional geochem data sets for all these different sheets, and they did a whole heap in the Capricorn origin, which is the bit between the Pilbara and the Yilgarn. And straight away I noticed that there was all this PGE anomalism, platinum at palladium anomalism in stream sediments. So I looked at it and it was related to all these dolerite sills, Proterozoic dolerite sills that sit in this origin between the Pilbara and the Yilgarn. So okay, that was pretty interesting, and I ended up working up a bit of a concept, and we got Inco really interested, and Inco wanted to do a joint venture. Inco, we're the biggest nickel company in the world. They had bought Voisey Bay, and then they merged with Falconbridge and became huge, and then they got taken over by Vale. But at the time, they were, apart from Western Mining, they were probably the most well-respected nickel company in the world, and they liked this idea that I put together. Not much came of it, so then I left, and then so you fast forward about till 2016 when Chalice make the discovery at Julimar. And I read an article somewhere where Alex Dorsch was talking about this atlas that Geoscience Australia had put together on nickel-copper, Proterozoic nickel-copper PGEs. And I said, what's this atlas? So I hunted it down, and then, and there's a map that we showed in our latest announcement yesterday. It's the whole of Australia. It shows all the hotspots for nickel, right? So sure, this Capricorn origin shows up as a nice high prospectivity, and I thought, So back in lockdown, back in like 2019-20, when I was starting to sort of put a few projects together, I started going back and looking at all the data sets for that area and seeing how much new information had been put together. Because, from 2010 onwards, I was busy with Doré, head down on gold exploration and production. So, but I found out that, so GSWA had done the stream sets, and there was all this PG anomalism. 2010, they'd done a seismic survey. They'd run these seismic lines over the edge between the Yilgarn and the Pilbara to see where the big faults were. And these faults are important because they're like your plumbing system that bring your mineralisation up. So we've got some geochem anomalies and we've got this plumbing system. And then in 2013, Geoscience Australia had done, and GSWA had done this big regional EM survey of the whole Capricorn origin. And the lines were 5K spacing, so pretty wide, but there's these big conductors, late time conductors. So you had rocks, plumbing system, geochem, and now you've got conductors. I thought, okay, this is sort of all starting to come together a bit. And then I found some other papers where people had done some work on these dolerite sills, GSWA, and had done some work on these dolerite sills, and the composition and the age is the same as the Giles complex in the West Musgraves, where Nebo and Babel were discovered. Then obviously since then you had the Nova discovery, so again Craton margin, Proterozoic, and then Chalice here, and Caspian and these other guys. So I basically started like pulling all those data sets together and making like a bit of a treasure map, and sort of giving scores for different things, and if it's near the fault, has it got a geochem anomaly, has it got the dolerite, is there a conductor, and building up areas that I thought were pretty interesting. So that's how it all came about. So I ended up pegging 4 or 5 exploration licenses that went into Miramar, and then pretty much as soon as I did that, First Quantum appeared on the scene, and they pegged some ground right next to us. I'm like, oh, okay, so this is validating the idea. And then Dreadnought appear on the scene, and pick up this ground, and now they're getting, nickel copper PG hits. So it was all sort of validating the concept that, it's Proterozoic margin, it's got all these ingredients. So the thing is, when we listed, most of them were applications. I actually picked up another application, and that got granted before all the rest of them. So it got granted before all the first ones, right? So that's at Mt Vernon. So Mt Vernon was the last one we pegged, and it was the first one that we granted. So we said, right, this is a big target. It's like a double EL, 140 blocks. Yeah. So, and what we had there, we had, some regional geology, the regional EM conductors. There's some historic soil sampling that CRA did back in the 90s that's got platinum palladium anomalies in them over like 10 k's of strike, sitting next to these dolerite sills. And IGO had a quick look at it back in, I don't know, 16 or 17 or something. But said that the best way to just kind of quickly focus down in this area is to do an EM survey. Get a helicopter out there, do a quick EM survey. That might give you some bullseyes straight away. Yeah. So we planned that middle of last year, but we had to negotiate with the pastoralist out there. So he didn't want us doing it at a certain time of the year. So we basically had to wait, and that's why we only just did it now in January. Yep. And straight away, the prelim data, I don't know, how much people know about EM, but when you do EM, electromagnetics, you have channels, and the channels are a certain time. So what happens is, they send a pulse of magnetic radiation down, and then it comes back, and it comes back in like segments over time. So we always talk about late time, because the late time channels are the ones that penetrate deeper into the ground, and if there's any sulfides or anything in the ground, it's the late time channels that give you the response. So whenever you're looking at announcements on EM, people always talk about late time, and it'd be like channel 30 or channel 40 or channel 45 or channel 49. So straight away we do this, we get all these late time anomalies. I think it's 13 late time anomalies. The lines are, the EM flight lines are 400 metres apart, but we're getting anomalies that are like 500 metres to 1.5 km. And they're sitting sort of on the edges of these dolerite sills. It's so exactly what you want to see.
So would the late time, the lateness of the time be affected by the amount of sulfides, or it's just the depth?
It's more the depth and the fact that they're present.
They're present.
Yeah. They're present or absent. You can't say too much about how much or how conductive or whatever from that. It's like a first pass thing, right? To help you focus in. But straight away we've taken this huge land position now, and we've got about 13 of these things that we can go, right, okay, now we can focus in on these things. And in the announcement I said that if you look at the whole tenement package, this sort of northeastern area, that's probably the most interesting. And on the western half of that, there's this historic soil sampling where there's PGE anomalism, pretty broad spaced, but it's there. But on the best part of the EM anomalies, there's no sampling. So you have to think, okay, well, maybe if I sample that eastern bit, I'm going to see PGE anomalism that's related to those conductors. So what we're going to do now, we've just got the prelim data. We have to wait for the final data. That has to get modelled up. So what the geophysicists do is they basically take that flight data and they start building models where they try different shapes and depths and dips and stuff of bodies, and then they do like a theoretical response, and then they compare that against the actual response. So then they come up with, is it steep, is it flat, how deep is it, and they'll come up with a series of models for all those anomalies. And then what you do probably now, we're at 400 metre line spacing now, you go out on the ground and you probably do ground EM. You pick the best 3 or 4 and you do ground EM, where you actually lay out a loop on the ground
spacing
and then really home in, and that will give you then a drill target to home into. So, but so far, you know, it's good. It's exactly what we wanted to see. You know,
from 5 kilometre spacing to 400. How significant? I mean, a lot of guys out there are not in our industry. So how significant is that in your?
Well, those anomalies, without much information on the magnitude of the anomaly at the moment till we see the final data, but the size, the spatial size of those anomalies, the best ones up in the northeast, that's the same size as a nova. That's the same size as a Ernest Henry. I mean, it's an ICG, but that's an EM anomaly. They're significant EM anomalies. They're significant size. So, you know, they, and where they sit on the edges of these dolerite sills. See, the model is that you have a structure, the fluid comes up the structure, deposits out into the sill, and where the sill, if the sill goes over a sedimentary unit that's got some sulfide in it, so it's like a black shale or something, it's a bit like, how to explain it? So imagine you've got a cup of tea, right, and you put some sugar in the tea, and the sugar dissolves. So think of that as the nickel and the copper in the PGEs, right? You keep putting more spoons of sugar in, it keeps dissolving, but at a point, it can't dissolve anymore. Right, so the dolerite sill goes over the top of the sediments with sulphur in them. The dolerite sill picks up the sulphur as it's going across it. At some point, it keeps dissolving the sulphur, but at some point, it can't dissolve anymore. So then the sulphur attaches itself to the nickel and the copper and the PGEs and drops out as sulphides. That's what you're looking for. That EM anomaly, hopefully, is that indication of those sulphides dropping out.
The intensity of the EM going from, you know, blue, yellow to red. Does that signify anything?
Yeah, well, that's just the strength of the anomaly. So the blue is basically nothing.
So the red has more sulfides than the yellows, and
it's more conductive.
More conductive.
Yeah, and the thing with the geophysics, you have to be a bit careful because lots of things can give you conductors. Even water can give you a conductor, right? But that's why, one, you're looking at the late time, because you don't want superficial stuff. You want deeper stuff. And also the late time is more indication of sulfides rather than clay or something like that. So, you know, till we see the final data, you know, you can't say too much, but I'd much rather see late time EM anomalies than early time. And I'd much rather see little sort of pinpoint 500 metre long EM anomalies than big long EM anomalies, because they're probably just related to a sedimentary unit. But when you see like a pinpoint or something that's trapped between faults or something, that's what looks more interesting.
I mean, I'm a converted when we start talking about deep crustal stuff. You know, I've had people coming here talking about you know, lithospheric signatures and structures, and it's just one of those things that people don't think about much, and they do talk about these margins and things like that, right?
The main thing to think about, just to really simplify it, when you're looking for a mineral deposit, you need really 3 or 4 things. You need a source of the metal or whatever. you need a plumbing system, and you need a trap. So in this case, the plumbing system is those big faults that are sitting between the Archean and the Yilgarn and the Pilbara. That's your plumbing system. Your source is your magma, your dolerites, and then your trap is where the sulfides are. So, and that's the same for gold too, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we talk about the Barara shear zone.
Yeah.
The Barara shear zone is your plumbing system, right? And then normally with gold, the geology is the trap, because the fluid comes up and then finds a bit of geology it likes, or a little jog it likes, and then it drops out. So that's what people think about, source, plumbing system, and trap. That's what you're looking for. So
because we had John Hronsky coming talking about how during that time, I mean, you mentioned Norilsk and all this, that they started rethinking about how they should be chasing this giant or these deposits. And they came to a conclusion exactly what you've just described about the margins, that where the deep-seated sort of crustal structures are, and a stroke of luck. And
if you go back to John's talk where he talks about the discovery of West Musgraves, there's a target map that shows WA, and it shows the margins.
That's right.
And one of those targets is Bangemall. But they decided to go to the West Musgraves because with Marbo and everything, that whole area had opened up.
That's
but
right.
one of the other targets is the Bangemall.
He had 3, I think, if I remember.
And Onslow as well, actually.
They had Bangemall, West Musgraves, and
Fraser.
Fraser. Yeah.
They've got the Bangemall, and there's actually a target at Onslow as well, which we can talk about Whaleshark in a minute. But there was a target at Onslow because it was on this margin as well. So
Well, let's go to Whaleshark, because Whaleshark is interesting, because I looked through your announcement, and there's a point where you talked about the MMI sampling and the relevance of that, because that's really interesting. I think a lot of people don't get that explanation of numbers.
Okay. So again, Whaleshark is another project that I've been involved in for a long time. Like, I worked on it with Western Mining back in '96, and the history was that we were there looking for an Ernest Henry, an ISCG. We're looking for an Ernest Henry, Olympic Dam, Prominent Hill, Carapatina, because we thought that it was the same geology in the Capricorn origin, in the Gascoyne complex, as it was in the Eastern Succession in Mount Isa and the Stuart Shelf and that in South Australia. So that project became available in 2019, so I pegged it, and I'd done a bit of work there back in the 90s. What you've got is you basically got the Capricorn origin, which is a Proterozoic, and then it goes undercover. You've got the Carnarvon Basin. So you've got up to 200 metres of sediments. Some places it's shallower, some places it's deeper. As you go towards the coast, it obviously gets deeper and deeper. But there's sort of like a corridor where it's about 100 metres. So it's reasonable exploration. And so I, as a geochemist back at Western Mining, I was trying to work out how we could explore through this material without going broke, and tried a whole different lot of geochemical techniques and what we call partial or selective leaches. So when you do soil sampling, or even when you do air core, most of the time you do a total analysis, which is a fire assay is called a total analysis. But there's these digests and analytical techniques that are called partial or selective. And partial means it only takes a certain amount of an element. So even aqua regia is like a partial digest. But there are things called selective leaches as well, which only take a certain part of an element. So MMI and BLEG and enzyme leach and things like that are what we call partial or selective digests. And the idea is that, the theory is that if you take an ore body and you cover it with dirt, and if it sits there for long enough, gas and water and stuff will move upwards from the deposit, and it will bring very small amounts of minerals of interest to the surface through gas or transfer or whatever. And then if you sample across the top and you have a sensitive enough technique and you have a sensitive enough analytical method, you should be able to see signatures of that. And this is what people have been working on for the last 20 or 30 years, to try and find a technique that will see through that sort of cover. So MMI is one of these techniques. And, you know, it's been successful in a lot of places. And the one that, you know, I really liked was at Havieron. So Havieron up in the Patterson, you know, 400 odd metres of cover. And before they discovered it, they'd done MMI sampling and they got copper, gold, silver, uranium, rare earths, lead and zinc anomalism. And there was a little bit of information published about it, but not much. But the other people, Antipa, had done it at Calibre and Magnum and all these things that up around Telfer, again through a couple of 100 metres of cover. And there was a bit of information in ASX announcements about that. So I thought, okay, well, let's go try MMI over Whaleshark. So Whaleshark's big target, it's about 30 k's long. It's a big folded banded iron formation with a granite. So we did 1 kilometre by 500 metre spacing, so sort of lines a k apart with samples 500 metres apart. And at the northeastern end, we got 2 really strong copper, uranium, rare earth anomalies. Nice and coherent, multiple samples. And the numbers, I think the highest copper number was 4,500 ppb. Now these are ppb, these are not ppm, they're not percent, but this is soil sampling through 100 metres of cover. So we're not really concerned so much about the actual numbers, so much as the coherence of the anomaly and the correlation between different elements.
Relative to background.
Relative to the background, and the correlation that you've got copper and uranium and silver, all anomalous in the same area. But when you do that and you then compare the numbers to, say, Havieron, I think the highest copper number at Havieron was 750 ppb, and we had 4,500. Now they've got 400 metres of cover, and we think we've only got about 100, so you take that into consideration. But also our sample spacing was a k by 500 metres, where theirs was 250 by 250. So, you know, it's pretty comparable. So I said, all right. So we went back and did infill, and there was 2 areas that we infilled, and we infilled them this time at 250 by 250 with MMI again. And yeah, they repeated. So we got strong copper, uranium, silver, some lead and zinc, but the copper, uranium, silver and rare earths, they're elements that you expect to see in an IACG, in an Ernest Henry, in a Carrapateena, in a Prominent Hill, Olympic Dam, whatever, you know. So the anomalies are big. They're like, I can't remember exactly, but I think they're, you know, a couple of k's by a couple of k's sort of size. So they're quite big anomalies with coherent correlating elements. The great thing is that back at Western Mining, we did some real wide-spaced reconnaissance RC holes to just get a idea of the basement depths. And there's some holes near one of the anomalies where the basement depth's only 40 metres. So, you know, we're not talking about the Stewart Shelf in South Australia drilling through 500 metres of cover, or 600 or 800. We're not in the Patterson origin like Havieron looking at 400 metres of cover. So on the basis of that, I started hunting around for whatever information I could find on Ernest Henry. And I actually found an atlas that the Queensland government had put together on the Ernest Henry deposit, which was discovered by Western Mining. And it had all sorts of maps of like geophysical signatures, geology, and MMI sampling.
Yes, they were doing that back then.
They did. I think they did it after the discovery, as like a sort of a
after the
orientation sort of exercise, right? But there's actual information on the MMI signature of Ernest Henry. But the other thing is there's a whole data set on interface drilling. So what I mean by interface drilling is it's a bit like what we're doing at Gidji. Drill through the cover when you get to the bedrock and just go into a couple of metres of bedrock and then take a sample of that interface.
Yep.
Because that interface is where all the water moves and everything.
Where the action is.
Yeah, so we think that what we can do next is, there's a bit of gravity data, but it's a bit sort of sporadic and not very well levelled, so we might have to do a gravity survey. ICG deposits, the I stands for iron, and that's normally hematite, and the hematite's dense. So gravity is normally a good signature of these things. So we'd probably go back and do a gravity survey just to get a brand new data set that's all sort of levelled. And then I think what we're going to do mid-year, we're going to get an air core rig, and we're just going to drill interface, do like a grid of interface drilling to see if we can get that MMI anomaly, but at the top of the basement, and then use that to then give us a drill target for like a diamond hole or an RC hole. But you know, the target there is an Ernest Henry, and an Ernest Henry, you know, the sort of rule of thumb of these IHCG deposits is, you know, 100 million tonnes at 1% copper, 1 gram gold. That's sort of what you're looking for. I think Ernest Henry is now about twice that big. Prominent Hills was about that size. Carapatina is about that size. You know, 1% copper, 1 gram gold, and bulk.
They tend to grow as you develop the thing as well.
They do, but they tend to be, they don't tend to grow laterally. They tend to be more up and down. They tend to be like a carrot or a plug or something. So Carapatina is the classic of that. Very small surface footprint, but deep. Javieron is sort of like, Javieron, I don't know if that's ICG. I've seen the core in that, and I'm not sure what people think it is yet. But again, that's sort of a cylindrical thing as well. So quite small surface expression, and they grow at depth rather than laterally. Olympic Dam's like a funnel. You know, Prominent Hill's a bit different. That's more sort of a bit structurally controlled. Ernest Henry's like a pipe. Had a very high conductive bit at the top where it had an EM anomaly, which is how it was discovered, and then it's like a pipe that goes down. So they have quite a small footprint on, you know, surface footprint, like not surface footprint, but sort of plan view footprint. But then they go deep. So that's your challenge, that because the plan view footprint's quite small, you want to do everything you can to focus in before you put the dual hole there. And you just talk to Rudy Gomez about that, how close you can be and miss it. But both of those, so Bangemall and Whaleshark, they're the more conceptual things, but they are the bigger prize.
I mean,
more risky but bigger prize.
I mean, Miramar is developing, and probably at this point in time, after this discussion, that you're actually now moving into a space where you've got major development at Gidji. Obviously, that's not a giveaway project. That's a must-keep project. Bangemall and Whaleshark seems to me also a must-do work kind of project.
The strategy for those projects really is probably to prove the concept up, and then find a big brother.
Right? I mean, look, when I think of Bangemall and Whaleshark, and as we've just discussed, they're the perfect place to look for these things now. And you're getting all the signatures. As you're talking, I'm imagining all your shareholders going, like, Allan, just go bloody hell drill a hole, you know? But I get what you're trying to do. It's obviously trying to define it. It's drilling a hole.
These holes are expensive. And if you drill, you know, you want to drill in the right place. You know.
I know, you
want to drill in the right place.
But
because you only get one crack at it.
Well, I get your the way you're doing it, because obviously you're trying to find the right place. Because sometimes when you just drill a hole and you miss it, you got no idea why you missed it. Is it not there, or is it just missed it, right? And I get that. And I think that's why that systematic thing, the way you guys do things. Sort of.
And I always sort of feel like you got to have a few irons in the fire, especially in the current market where it's hard to get results back. You imagine if we had one project and we're drilling and then we're sitting there waiting for results to then plan the next program. You know, we haven't even talked about Glandor, but you know, the strategy of the company was to have a few irons in the fire at different stages of exploration, the conceptual stuff and the stuff that's more advanced. And you're trying to advance the advanced stuff so that you can actually monetize it, and then sort of proof of concept with the conceptual stuff, right? And then it's like, you know, your bread and butter Eastern Goldfields, close to town, you can go drill it whenever you want, and if you find something, you're probably going to get taken out. Whereas the stuff that's a bit more challenging logistically, it's up north, where Onslow the other day, it was 50.7 degrees, hottest temperature in Australia in 60 years, right? Yeah. So, you know, Bangemall and Whaleshark, you want to be there in the winter time, so you don't have the all year round news flow. So it's this having a couple of things going, so your bread and butter and your sort of high risk, high reward stuff. Yeah. But, you know, so you're always juggling what can I do in this one to advance this cheaply, you know. So any sort of cheaper surface techniques like gravity or soil sampling, if that helps you home into a drill target, that's much cheaper and much more cost effective than going and drilling 20 diamond holes, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why I say to a lot of people, you know, a lot of people ask me about what you guys do. I said, you know, that's how it's done. And I think if you watch how Allan gets and does things, that's how good exploration. And you've only got that amount of funding to do. It's never endless. No. Even though today the market seems like it's endless.
Yeah.
You know,
well, it's endless
easy
for some things.
Yeah. But,
no, but we can talk about that. You know, like end of December, we've got 3 million in the bank. So we raised 8 million in the IPO. Basically, you know, an IPO costs you, I think it costs us almost $1 million. So by the time you've paid all your bills and everything from the IPO, and paid the brokers and the independent geos and everything, I think we started with about 7. Yeah. Right. So basically, in a year, we're down to about 3. We're very proud to say that we've spent over 75% of the money that's gone out the door has been on exploration. Our overheads are very low, and so we listed in October, so we're just over sort of halfway through. When you put a prospectus out, you have a 2-year budget in your prospectus, so we're pretty much spot on. You know, we've probably spent a little bit more than we budgeted on exploration. But that's because we've been following up good results. And we spent less on working capital and overheads. So we've spent that on exploration rather than overheads. So that's what you got to do. You know, there's nothing more frustrating to see a company go out and raise money and tell people they're going to do all this stuff, and they sit on their hands for 12 months. And you go, well, I could have done that. I could have put it in the bank. Yeah. You know, and got, well, not much interest these days, but you know, I could put it in the bank. Yeah. You know. So we were out there on the ground, testing targets, doing what we said in the prospectus. Gidji, every time, you know, it's progressing and we're advancing the project. And this current drill program is really a really important milestone for Marylebone to see whether there's something below this air core. Yeah. Now, yeah, as I said, it's 2 Ks by K with consistent gold and silver, which tells you that it's in bedrock, not in alluvial material. So there's got to be a reason for that to be there. So hopefully we'll find out in the next, you know, couple of weeks.
Well, you know, that's the name of the game, as they say.
Yeah.
Look, Allan, it's look, I've let this go because I think the content's fantastic. No, it's great because a lot of guys, the feedback I'm getting is that they just don't understand why even, you know, you explaining EM was fantastic, because people look at it and they always ask me, well, what does that actually mean, you know? Yeah. And I must say a lot of times...
And this is a geochemist explaining geophysics, right? Well, so, you know, I'm doing my best, but you know...
Yeah, so look, guys, as I say, you know, reach out to Allan or leave some comments and I'll pass it on to Allan, but just the fact that he's you know, given that time to talk about the project extensively in this Rooster Talk, I think it's fantastic. I think great. You know, Allan, thank you for your time.
Yeah, no worries.
Look,
thanks. Always a pleasure.
It's really good that you've just given us that real insight into everything, which is what I was hoping for anyway. So
No worries.
again, guys, thank you, and Alan, we'll talk again.
Yeah, no worries. Great. Thanks.